Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk today about things that are in the text that I think I've spoken about already in a number of ways. As I reviewed those areas that I thought maybe I hadn't given, um, full time to, I realized I talked about most of these things in some way or the other. But that doesn't mean it's organized in your head necessarily. But I hope that as I'm talking about this, you find reference points from things that I've spoken about before. As you can see, I'm looking down. I have a few notes to help me remember what I want to talk about. I also have my cup of coffee, which I might sip from every now and again. I'll try to make that one of the few. Okay, so let's start from the beginning that my view of people with severe, profound disabilities is probably at the lower end of the ability for functioning. And many of my comments in class has been about that population of students because oftentimes what people learn are skill sets for moderate or milder learning challenges, and they just kind of scoot them down. And it's really not a good way to think about working with kids with these really severe needs. In fact, we probably would do better to think about infancy and move our way up. Okay? Now, I want to be very clear. I've talked a lot about self-determination. I've talked a lot about how we need to treat students at their chronological age. So saying starting at infancy up has more to do with developmental levels than it has anything to do with how we interact with, respect, work with people, for example, who are 16 years old but still need diaper changes and things like that. So even now, my comments are going to be more toward this really severe population because I do find it's probably the one thing that we send students out with the least amount of experience. And in some ways, when I say that's okay, I don't mean it as a justification, but this is a very low incidence group, and it's most of our students are not going to work in this population. Anyway, so again, these aren't justifications, but I want you to have certain pieces of this. So if you choose to go in this direction, you have a foundation which to build from. The other caveat, and I thought about this as I was researching the text and looking for things that I wanted to speak with you about, is that so many of these things that I want you to get, I honestly couldn't teach you unless I had a kid in front of me. Like, this is how you position, or this is how, with a kid who has certain kinds of healthcare or motor needs, either one where the head needs to be positioned in a certain way, literally not just for teaching, but for helping the student avoid any kind of damage that could be life-threatening. So as we think about a lot of those issues, it's hard to show you, it's hard to tell you, it's hard to describe. What I found is that people who are interested in this area will spend more and more time, because of their interest, with populations of students where you can observe and see how professionals interact with students. You can see what students' learning needs are, what students' capabilities are, capacities are. And it's really one of the best ways to learn. So I'm going to take a good hit at this and see if I can do it well for you anyway. So establishing that notion that we're talking about kids with really very serious challenges in communication, it could be motoric and sensory integration, all kinds of things. I've said from the beginning that cause and effect is really one of the best ways to think about engaging with a student who is either not engaged or difficult to engage, or whose engagement seems very chaotic, erratic. It doesn't seem to be something that the student is using in some meaningful way to interact with their environment, or to be able to establish some mutuality between people and environment. And the reason I just note that over and over again is that if you think about infancy going up, what's the first thing we do with babies? We're like, look, mommy's here, look, daddy's here, look in my eyes. We do a lot of things to engage the infant, to orient them to their world, and to give them a sense of mastery of their world so that they can individuate from us. Okay, so if you think about that, it helps you understand thinking about the same kinds of interactions and games and things that we play with infancy, that with kids who are older, we just want to move it up. So it may be something that you may be dealing with coins, or you may be dealing with some kind of picture system or whatever. And in a time, you may be like, here's the picture, look at it now. You may be doing something that's at an older level, but you're building in something that brings mutuality about. I also want to mention something about preference assessments. If you don't know what students prefer, it will increase aggression and it will increase communication failures. And there are two things in the literature that I want you to know about that are very important, and that is the best means we have to reduce aggressive behavior is to provide children, people, with optimal environments that are based on preferences and the ability to communicate. And that doesn't mean that people can talk or verbally indicate what they want. Sometimes it's not even that they can give us some cue. We have to observe the environment to understand what their preferences are. So one thing that I would encourage you to think about is looking for correction errors, okay? What that means to me is when you see an error in a student's learning cycle, let's say that you're starting here and you're going to work on some kind of an interaction skill here, and then you're going to go here, and so maybe the 3-point plan is to engage the student in eye contact, move the student to an activity, and then have the student come back to you with eye contact. It's a simple like 3-point or 3-step kind of plan. It's really easy. Pardon me, my eye is just itching. I was trying not to do it, but it really itches, okay? Okay, so if you're thinking about just like that 3-point or 3-step plan, okay, look for where the errors occur and then correct there. So for example, maybe you engage in eye contact and go do this like with the student like this, right? And the student suddenly looks away, right? Maybe the engagement was too long. Maybe it should be more brief, like, oh, there you are, and then go to the activity. It's a correction error, it's the correction of an error. But I always call it, looking for correction errors so that you find places that you can correct the moment in which you see some behavioral reaction to your intervention so that it becomes more like what you want to see in the chained behavior that the student has or will accomplish. Also, you want to think about improving generalization in a number of ways, but I'm just going to go over three of these. One is you definitely want to arrange antecedents and consequences prior to what you're going to do in terms of teaching or intervening. So I just used the example of the 3-step process. If the antecedent might be that the student engages better when he's sitting by the fan, I always want to have the student sitting by the fan to give maximal interaction abilities because the student is calmer or somehow this sets him about in a way that he becomes more engaged. Okay? So that would be an antecedent. A consequence could be anything from something tangible, and I don't like food tangibles, but for some children, a little taste of something, like a bite of a little pudding they like or something like that, can actually be a logical consequence because that's kind of what we would do with younger kids as well. Although I'd look for more social reinforcers first. However, you need to have that together so you have a basic protocol. When the student sits by the fan and is able to look at you, and then you move the student over to the activity. The student looks at you at the activity, you make eye contact again, and then the consequence is the student gets an arm rub, or you rub their hand. Okay, like I don't know if you can see this, but I do a lot of this palm pressure on kids and they just love it, or with their fingers. Now, I'm not suggesting any or all students would like that. I'm saying that that's more of a social reinforcer that the student might like, that they would take in as this feels good, start the process over again. One of the ways you would improve generalization is to take the student away from the fan. Is he gonna do it like when the fan's not around, okay? And that might be something that you start with like kind of what we've talked about with interval prompts. I mean, even though it's not exactly the right terminology there, it might be something where the fan goes off and you continue to work with a student. It might be something where you would take the student away from the fan and work on this and then take the student back to the fan, and that becomes the consequence. Like, the good behavior leads to this. I hate I said good behavior. How about I say mastery and competency feels good? And so, I mean, this is kind of maybe a silly way to put it, but it's like after a long day of work, you feel great, you've done some really good stuff, and you come home and have a cold beer, this guy has a fan. Okay, so also, the text has got a lot of good things about use of peers. And what I have found, for example, in my private practice work when I've done groups, is even though that wasn't with kids with really severe disabilities, children learn really well from watching other children and watching how they enact behaviors, how they utilize social environments so that they're able to engage in a way that's more productive. This is not about a student with severe and profound disabilities, but I did a group one time where there was a guy there. All the guys were like maybe 14 to 16, and this kid on the autism spectrum just talked and talked and talked, and it was about, you know, kind of extraneous details, and he was very judgmental. You know, somebody'd say something and he'd say, well, I think the correct whatever, and he had a kind of voice like that. And so just honestly, he could be a little annoying. You know, loved him. He really was a cool kid, but he could be really annoying. And so week after week, we worked on that. You know, like, you know, say only things that other people want to talk about. So anyway, we had a guy in the group who was like the Fonzie of the group. I can't think of a better example. Maybe the James Dean. You know, he was like, everybody in the group thought he was really cool. He hated coming. He told us all the time he hated coming, used bad language, would slump down in his chair. And the other guys in the group thought he was really cool, right? And so one day, and I'm not going to use the language, but I will tell you exactly what he said. One day he looked at him and was like, do you ever shut the F up? Really loud. And this kid just kind of looked at him and he's like, shut up. Now, in that environment, we didn't intervene. Like, that's not a nice thing to say, all that stuff. We let it sit there. And the kid said, okay, and I'm not kidding. From then on, he would come in. Sometimes he would look at that kid and go like, was that enough or too much? It was amazing. Like, in this simple moment of using a peer, using the environment, this kid went from, you know, kind of rambling about nothing of interest to anybody else but himself into really engaging in a really very nice way. So if you look at page, let's see, 195, it's figure 8.1, there's a really good summary of some generalization strategies that you should look at because they're very, very important to understanding a whole range of ways that we can teach generalization skills. Well, I was going to think about ecological environments or assessment, but I better not go forward or I'll get lost. So let's go on to portfolio assessment. Chapter 9 goes into much greater detail about it. I just want to suggest that I've used portfolio assessment before, and I find that for kids who have more profound disabilities, it is a wonderful way to assess because it makes assessment on their terms. It provides live, real examples of what they've produced. And there are some things that I want to say that I just don't want to sound politically incorrect or demeaning. Okay, so let me say it anyway, okay? A lot of the kids in this population are not going to make really good life gains. They just aren't. I mean, you see kids who come in these categories who may never operate above like the age of 2. You know, some kids are even, you know, kind of infancy, no matter how big their bodies get. And so when working with families, I just found the portfolio assessment to be a wonderful way to take products that students created or things that they had done, and then to talk about the things that they learned. Okay, it could be something as simple as just a pudding painting or something that, you know, the child makes, and it may just be, you know, hand marks all over the place. But to use that to talk about fine motor skills, to talk about sensory integration, to talk about focusing on a task, to talk about task perseverance, toleration of frustration. All of those kinds of things can be talked about in one product or artifact in the portfolio. So I'm a big believer in that. I'm also a big believer in inclusion. So let me just talk about that for a moment, okay? Where we get in trouble, and I know this came up in class, where we get in trouble talking about inclusion is that we tend to think of taking a child who has severe profound disabilities, pushing their wheelchair into chemistry 3 and placing them there and saying that the teacher will take the curriculum and break it down to their level. Okay, now that's probably a little extreme, but not by much, okay? And the reason I say not by much is we have really boxed ourselves in, and families, to thinking of as inclusion as being this academic endeavor in which people with disabilities can move into the classroom and access the general curriculum. Very much a part of UDL, very much something that I support wholeheartedly, but there are other ways we can look at inclusion. My definition of inclusion is finding, well, that's not really a definition, but finding all of the environments that you can across the school to help students interact pro-socially with other children, hopefully in collaborative efforts, collaborative endeavors, okay? I'm kind of at a loss here. I mean, I've used this example before, but this student would have been in the moderate range, but it kind of makes a good example. He was in a school working, and he was in a vocational class, and one of the things he was working on was recognizing denominations of money. And he's a funny guy. Anyway, I came in one day, and the cheerleaders had a bake sale or something going to raise money. And I said to his teacher, jokingly, and I knew her, I said, "Why isn't he out there, identifying coins?" She said, "What?" And I said, and this kid, oh my God, he loved women. In fact, there was an issue with that, with him kind of staring at women's breasts and the young women in the high school and them getting a little freaked out. So I said, "Look, why don't you get him down there with the cheerleaders? They can say, give 3/4 back or whatever. He can identify coins all day long, and he can learn how to enjoy those beautiful girls without staring at their breasts," okay? And it sounds silly, but it was one of those things where it worked. Helping him engage in the environment where he could and actually work on skills he needs to work on, both socially and academically, is my idea of inclusion. I hope that helps, because I know sometimes people just understand it within this box of services, academic environments, etc. The text also talks about circle of friends and other ways that you can use peers. There's a nice figure, or a nice, I put in figure 1-2, and I bet that's not correct, because that'd be at the beginning, maybe 11-2. But anyway, there's a nice little figure in the book that talks about ways to use peers that I think is really excellent. I just want to comment on one piece of this that I think is really, really important, okay? The only way we get to know each other well in life is that we learn about each other, the good, the bad, the ugly, okay? If I have a temper and you're my friend, you may from time to time need to say to me, like, "Look, you really got a temper, and this is really what it is, and I don't like it," etc., okay? We learn lots of things about each other. And what we know about each other helps us manage our own behavior and, most importantly, our feelings and our thoughts and the way we perceive each other. The same is so vitally true for the peers who come in and work with students with disabilities. What I always recommend is that parents be closely involved so that there are no issues around any violations of confidentiality, which is the thing you'll often hear. And it's important, but I think it's overstated by schools because they don't think of actually engaging the family. Anyway, in a way that the students who are working with these other students, the peers of children with disabilities, know much more intimately what's going on. What's autism? What's it mean when a kid has a primitive reflex and he's going like this and he hits me? If my only interpretation of being hit is that this guy doesn't like me, then I'm going to have a completely wrong perception. My mental set about how I'm going to get involved with this kid is now changed, right? He doesn't like me, so I'm going to stay further away. Or even if I didn't get that impression, I may be like, oh, this guy really doesn't know how to control himself, so I'm staying far away. If we help kids understand and we tell them, their comfort level absolutely increases exponentially. When I've explained to kids with permission of their parents what autism is about, they are on that kid like a cheap suit. I'm telling you, they are. Because suddenly, it's not that you find out, this is what I have found, it's not that they didn't want to interact with the kid, they were afraid. They didn't know how. They were afraid that they would set something off or whatever. Reducing that fear, reducing that discomfort is extraordinarily important to making sure that peer programs work. Another thing that we've talked about is universal design for learning, and I mentioned that just a moment ago. I want you to think about that as I just spoke of earlier about this young guy who was at the table with the cheerleaders. I want you to think of UDL as not just these multiple levels of representation and response, because that's enormously important to what we're doing here. But I also want you to think about it in terms of the least restrictive environment. And I don't hear this stated like this as much as I think maybe it should be. But I know in the beginning of class, I drew this line on the board. I just went across like this, and I said, gifted is here. Kids with really low functioning disabilities are over here, and there's this continuum all the way along, and we plug people in. Okay, so let's just say that on this continuum we have services down here for kids who are gifted, and we have services down here for kids who have more limitations. Where do they fit in the range in other ways? Remember, we're not just thinking in services, we're thinking in terms of abilities and supports. So the example that I used about this young man with the cheerleaders is my approach to UDL, meaning that, wow, we could really look up this, like if we're starting, the camera thing is backwards, it's confusing me, I'm sorry if you see me doing this. Well, I guess you did see me. If you take this across and you look at it, you can go out of that box of services, out of that box of standard environments, self-contained, resource, inclusion, and move into, wow, we can look in several places along this continuum based upon certain skills, but the continuum is fluid. It's developmentally fluid, meaning that sometimes development goes up and down, meaning kids regress for certain reasons, particularly kids who have health concerns or other needs that they, like, for example, this isn't a good example for severe profound, but muscular dystrophy, in which there is a decline in ability over time. If you look at it developmentally, you're going to see one way of looking at that whole continuum. If you look at it in terms of environments, you move out of all of those ideas I was just talking about in another way. It's like, where across this continuum can we practice identification of coins, right? Because that might be something a kid can do in a math class. That might be something a kid can do in the cafeteria. That might be something a kid can do with the cheerleaders. I think of UDL like that. So, like, it's multiple means of representation, multiple means of response, and it's multiple means of where the heck you do it. And that last piece, I think, is something that we don't look at enough. And what I'm talking about now as well is embedded instruction. The more bang for the buck is really how you want to think about it. The more skills that we can teach that are embedded in something else that we're doing, the better. So, for example, if I'm working with a student who is able to identify survival signs, let's say matching or whatever, I may also have embedded in my structure or my instruction, I may have some motor prompts that I'm working with to help the student use their hands or some other way of manipulating the cards that we're matching. I may be working on taking sort of a glance to a gaze task. I may be working on helping the student orient by sound. You get the point. So if you embed as many experiences for learning within your instructional tasks, particularly when they're a specific task, think about that. Okay, like I'm going for use of functional signs, or the ability to read functional signs, fire, exit, whatever, stop. And looking at those, I'm going to build in all these other things. And part of embedded instruction, too, goes back to, gosh, I'm not going to try to overuse this guy with the cheerleaders, but going back to that, you can see where all the embedded instruction was. If anybody just looked at the task that was taking place, or the activity, they would probably say something like, oh, that's so great that, I think his name was Brian. It's so great that Brian's, helping the cheerleaders. He must be having fun. That's what we want him to think. But you and I know that in our work together, by embedding things in the instruction, you and I realize that there's so many more things going on, and we want them to be embedded. We don't want to have a sign up that says, Brian's learning to count money. Yay, Brian, right? We just want the social experience to be what comes across embedded instructions. And it's an amazingly useful strategy, and it's critically important for kids who have lots of skills to learn to just get to somewhat of a developmental plateau that may be still pretty low, but using those abilities and those capacities to try to promote their inclusion, their sense of autonomy and mastery, so that when instruction takes place, they just are learning all sorts of things. That's also generalization and maintenance of skills, because they become internalized around behaviors that become common, and then they're utilized more frequently. Communication skills is extremely important, and I apologize, I was going to write down where this is, but in the communication chapter, sorry about that, I didn't write that down, but there's a Bill of Rights right at the beginning of that chapter, and I would encourage you to look at it, because what I find easy for people to do in terms of communication is to really limit or place limitations on students based on what students can't talk about, or to become disrespectful to students in a way that they may not even realize they're doing. I mean, I've seen people do things like this. We're like, no, look at the sign, fire, and they start taking on tones and ways of working with students that really start becoming combative and not fun to listen to. Students need to have a lot of choice of preference in terms of how they communicate. They need to have the ability to say that they're done communicating. Communication for us is absolutely the only way. This might sound a little melodramatic, but communication is the only way that Mark Melton can give you a sense of his soul, his identity. The inside of me can only be shown to you by the way I tell you it, okay? I mean, yes, I can act some of it out, but a lot of it is what I tell you. So if I just came into class one day and I said to you, you're going to tell me what the Communication Bill of Rights is, and it's I think maybe 10 steps, I don't recall, but you're going to tell me the 10 Bill of Rights, and you're going to tell me now, okay, everybody listen, and you're sitting there freaked out, and I say, tell me now. What I've done is I've given you a skill set that you're unable to do. Now, you maybe could memorize them, but I haven't asked you to do that. I haven't prepared you for that. You don't have a prerequisite skill to do it. We mess up communication stuff all the time because we make communication about performance rather than an ability to interact comfortably, which is really what it is. It's what it's about. Communication also really helps build intentionality, which is exactly what I've been saying about cause and effect and about mutuality. If you think of cause and effect, think about Piaget and when you learned about how we develop schemata and we start building higher level thinking skills. As you know, Piaget talked about that as being an unfolding process based on maturation. So we know that developmentally, a lot of the students that we work with may not get to that place because they literally are not going to mature cognitively to do that. However, using scaffolding as a way to build schemata using communication skills is really only effectively done if you understand the student's needs and their functions to get those needs met. So a lot of times what we're looking at is I see a kid who is like pounding, 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 and maybe making noise, and I finally realize that the child's hungry. Okay, well, to me, we just had lunch 10 minutes ago or 20 minutes ago. How many times have you had lunch and gotten up and went, I'm still hungry, right? Just because somebody had lunch 20 minutes ago doesn't mean that they're not still hungry. So once you realize this is about hungry, right, you might teach the sign for eating. The student may only be able to go like this. Doesn't matter. If this is their sign for eating, we have communication intent. Then we have reciprocity and that I understand who you are. Then the student feels like they have more control of their environment. When I go back to infancy, it goes like this. Wah, wah. My mommy's breast comes out, and the baby is nourished and nurtured. It's that simple. And if you think about that with the students we work with, the more that we give them some predictability by understanding their communication, the greater their ability is to communicate. And I'll say it one more time, you won't believe the reduction in aggressive types of behaviors because people feel much more a sense of being understood, contained, etc. If you look at page 285, table 11.1 has a good overview of how you can look at real environments, the questions that might lead you to looking at a student's performance in real environments. And I turn to that because I want you to really consider the appropriateness of ecological assessment. When we're looking at ecological assessment, we're looking at how it's like the antecedents again and the consequence. We're looking over the environment, we're looking over interactions, we're looking over the physical arrangements of the environment, the social cues in the environment, even things like lighting. I mean, one of the things that bothers me is I tend to have that tinnitus is what it's called. My ears ring. And when I'm in classrooms like we meet in at the university, I don't know if I can hear those lights or it just somehow seems to intensify it, but I hate those lights. Many kids on the spectrum hear sounds that people who are neurotypical do not hear. So the environmental assessment or the ecological assessment just really knows no bounds. You really are trying to look at the entire landscape and figure out what you see. So figure 11.2 on page 292 provides an overview of some things that I think are really important, and I am just going to flip over and look at that really quickly with you. This chart gives us a sense of what the reasons are for a learner's communications. The reasons a learner would have to communicate. I apologize. And going down that chart, you can see how they use a rubric or a problem-solving process to come down to what kind of modes of communication would be helpful for the student. When you do that, let's talk about what I think is most important, interaction styles. I joke all the time, and I think I have a good sense of humor. I hope you do. But I've met people who, doing trainings, I've met people saying, like, he thinks this is all about him. He thinks he's funny, but he's not that funny. And, those hurt first time around. And then as I trained more, the more I realized my humor, in the beginning, like my humor now is just because I like to do it. I don't. It's just who I am. But when I realized I was using humor to kind of like make people like me, so in case my presentation was awful, they would like get over it. It was my insecurity. I realized how off-putting that was to people. And it may still be off-putting to some people. I don't know. But I haven't been told that lately. But everyone has an interaction style. Some are serious, some are humorous. Some people like this. Some people like just to have a more serious look. When we think of how we interact with students with disabilities, and this would be across the range, we need to look at who we are. Okay? We need to look at who we are. We need to look at how a student relates to us. We need to see if we can change something about our interaction styles that increase their comfort and ability for communication. We need to look at their styles and see what it seems to be their preference. And one of the ways I think it's easiest to kind of look at this is if you have 3 or 4 people working in a classroom, let's say paraprofessionals, or you have other service people, PT, OT, those types, those service personnel. You can utilize them to look at who the student seems to interact best with, and then observe why. Why does the student like this person best? I will use with you just an example that came out of not working with kids with severe profound disabilities, but with my students in an alternative program who had a lot of emotional behavioral problems. It was tough, and one of the things that was really tough is they were adolescent boys, most of them, and they were very threatened by me being gay. They didn't like that. I mean, it scared them, made them nervous. And so there were lots of reactions to me based on that. And frankly, it hurt my feelings. And it didn't hurt my feelings because of their reactions. I understood them. It didn't hurt my feelings because I'm so fragile. It was like, why does it have to be like this? I mean, because they'd make conversations about how, like, I didn't even know what it was like to be with a girl. I thought, why does it have to be like this? Okay. The point of all that context about me is that we got a student teacher, and she worked with me in the classroom, and she was totally hot. I mean, hot. And I mean, the guys were like insane about her. I thought she was fantastic. We got along so well together, and we would literally like give each other, grief during our work together in the classroom. It upped my social ante like that much. I mean, all of a sudden it was like, Mr. Melton, yeah, he's cool. I think they actually might have had an idea that she and I might have, going to get it on or something, and I'm not being fresh for a video. I think that might be what they thought. Now, as weird as this sounds, let's go back and think about it. Look at how the interaction styles changed when somebody else came on the scene. Look at how the interaction styles were with me at that time, and what might I have done to improve or help students get more comfortable with who I am. This sounds like it's so not related to working with students who might have severe disabilities, but it's highly related, because it's hard to look at ourselves and go, you know what, this student doesn't like me, or this student doesn't interact well with me. Okay, I got into some trouble in a class one time, and I was really called on the carpet because a woman felt like I was being very disrespectful to women by something I'd said. What I'd said was that, so I'll do it again. What I said was, if you have like a, oh gosh, maybe I'm going to get in trouble again. If you kind of have this like middle-aged, let's say, kind of frumpy woman, right? And by frumpy, I don't mean fat, ugly. I just mean, kind of your average whatever, okay? And you have some 25-year-old aide who's really, really good looking, right? I was saying up the student's, social standing or social status by sending him down the hall with her. And I meant that because high school boys, for example, are going to look at her and go, oh my gosh, and it's going to be like, she's with Teddy. It ups social status. It's been proven to do so. Now, here's why I got in trouble. That turned into like, well, you act like if anybody's gained a little weight or if somebody's not a model. I'm like, you guys, I'm so not about that. Okay, I hope you know that. What I was trying to say was, students will take to certain people differently and for all kinds of reasons. And oftentimes the reasons that they take to us are confronting. Like, I want to be like my straight colleagues, right? I want to be like Miss 25-year-old hottie over here, right? We're not. So if that's where you find yourself, you really have to look at who you are, and you really have to say interaction and communication and the kinds of things that we do together are based very much on how we do or don't like someone. It's how we make friends. It's how we choose the work colleagues we hang out with. So I hope I wasn't politically incorrect. I could have said, oh gosh, I could say, oh, hey, wait, see, I'm going to get rid of that. Because when I was teaching, I was young, a young skinny thing, okay, I just thought of this. We had an intern who came in. He was drop dead gorgeous, okay? He was like a model. He was on the track team at Kansas University. He was just so good looking. He was amazingly nice. I mean, one of the kindest men I'd ever met in my life. Anyway, and he was just a real straight dude. And what I mean by a real straight dude is, you know, you just tend to look at him and wonder, okay, the kids loved him. I mean, all over the building. And so when, you know, he would go out with one of our students, the kids would stop all the time. I think the girls wanted him as a boyfriend. The boys wanted to be like him when they grew up, right? It was confronting to me. Okay. Again, it wasn't like it made me crazy. I didn't seek counseling over it, but it was hard for me because I'm like, all this guy does is just show up and everybody is like really into him. And, you know, I have to work hard for that, you know, but he just represented that kind of all-American good guy. So I'm going to start using that example because then it won't look like I'm a misogynist, horrible person. All right. There's also a nice list or a table on 11.3, it's page 298 about social exchanges and how those can be enhanced or utilized, and I just encourage you to look at that. There's also a section on naturalistic teaching, and I'm not going to spend much time on that because naturalistic teaching really encompasses many of the things that we're talking about now: embedded instruction, ecological assessment. But again, what it really focuses on are ways to use the rhythms and routines and activities of our everyday living that can have elements to it that offer a chance to use it to teach skills. And it's much better for generalization and maintenance. If it's sort of like, you know, I say as a learner, you know, I'm a visual learner. Like I'm an auditory learner in some ways, okay? Like if probably one of the reasons I yak in classes, I really like kind of a lecture style. If people are engaging, I like listening. But when it comes to like building something from IKEA, I'm one of those people who does not read the directions at all. I put it together and it's completely wrong, and then I read the directions and I'm very kind of dyslexic, I've learned in some way or other, because I really can't, I turn things all the time and then it's still a mess and I'm still having a hard time with it. My best way of learning things like that is to have someone show me. If they show me once, I'll remember how to do it, okay? The reason I'm pointing that out is in naturalistic teaching, we would be looking at that UDL idea of multiple means of representation and response. And so, if I'm working always in a naturalistic setting, I'm constantly looking at the prompt levels and the things the student needs, but they're coming in response to my observation and understanding of the whole environment and then add it in. We're not going to go like he needs to learn this, here's the activity. We're going to say he needs to learn this, this is where it fits into the environment. In terms of behavior management, I didn't go much into that because it should be things that you've gotten out of the behavior management course, but I would refer you to the information on stereotypic behaviors, self-injurious behaviors, aggressive behaviors, and inappropriate social behaviors, because those are 4 categories that are of particular concern to students with severe disabilities. The stereotypic behaviors are kind of like what we think of sometimes we see it sometimes in autism, but I've seen kids who, for example, they do things like this. Kids who are visual disabilities will rock themselves. Oftentimes the use of those behaviors by students is really trying to get increased sensory input. Because as we'll talk about in just a minute or two, if you have a low a low muscle tone, or you have low muscle tone, get it right in a minute, oftentimes that comes along with sensory kinds of issues. And so you'll see things that just look awful, even banging your head against the wall really hard. And it's really not what we would think of, which is like, and I'm not saying it to be facetious, but like, wow, he really had a bad day. We would immediately attribute something to it. It's usually just about seeking sensory input. So as we think about what we do in our intervention, we first want to understand what those behaviors are, okay? Like many self-injurious behaviors are the same thing. It's really just about getting sensory input. I want to separate out that aggressive behaviors can be about the very same thing, or aggressive behaviors can be about disrespecting the client or the student. I said client because I was thinking of a guy that I used to have to diaper. He was older, and I remember one time when I was doing something, and just to be blunt, I did something like I put his penis wrong or something, and he just kind of let out this like yell, and he was looking at me or whatever. I didn't do anything that was inappropriate is the wrong word. I didn't do anything that was like, I just put it where it would go. Okay, let me just put it that way. I finally just kind of adjusted it another way and pulled his pants up, and he was like that. I have no idea what the feeling was, okay? But I'm going to tell you, this man, and he was a big man, and he had cerebral palsy, and he was very, very compromised by it. When things didn't go his way, he would get aggressive fast. And I mean, he started getting that look on his face like, I'm going to beat your head off. And I kept thinking, what have I done? All I did was change his diaper. Once I realized how he liked to be diapered, it was over. I didn't get any more kind of aggressive behavior. One of the reasons I use that example is because it is personal. It's the kind of stuff we don't usually talk about. And because it's something that I would never think about in my life. If somebody said to me, what would lead to an aggressive behavior? And I'd say, well, certainly how you diaper a guy. That would never come to my mind. But I started realizing that one of the best ways to respect this man was to literally look more closely at things that were about his personal care. And I began to do more things like, for example, if I was putting the diaper back on or something, I would do things like, is that okay, buddy? And he did have some cognitive abilities for understanding and communicating. He was still very compromised. But, I'd say, yes, all right, buddy, like that, because I don't want to get it wrong kind of thing. And he would just big laugh. And I'm telling you, I built so much rapport with him after that one incident. And it was right after I'd started working there, so I didn't know him very well. But I think, and I'm sure there were other things going on, don't get me wrong, but I do think that one incident created a lot of a bond between us and made the aggressive behavior go down. When you think about inappropriate social behaviors, you want to think about environments, frankly, in where you can try these things out in terms of behavior management. Working with adolescents in this range of functional ability, when I've worked with adolescents at that level, I have often seen students who do things like masturbate in public. I was just telling someone the other day about a young woman. Well, she's a woman now, but at the time she was a young woman, I guess 16 or something, and she really liked me a lot, and I quite liked her, and she was really comfortable with me, and she came in one day, and she was sort of scratching like this, and she's putting her hand down, and I said, Megan, what's the matter? I go, I don't understand what happened, like that, and she literally pulled her blouse down with both of her breasts hanging out, and she goes, see right here, Mr. Melton, this is what it is, and she's sort of like showing me her breast, okay? She didn't have a lot of inappropriate social behaviors, but it was hard for me to explain to her why she couldn't do that. And I'll tell you why it was hard to explain, is she didn't do anything in her mind that was wrong. I was her teacher. She loved me. That wasn't sexual. That wasn't provocative. It was Megan and me, right? But somehow then I have to look at it as being a skill set I have to teach. And it's hard to understand how to do that. So with kids who are talking and stuff who don't understand, I always just work with, it's a social rule. This is one of the rules that people in our world live by. That sounded a little too high, but that's sort of how we teach it. I don't try to get people to understand. So, like with Megan, what I said was, oh, when you're talking to a teacher, you keep your breasts on the inside, put them back in, and she did. And I said, and then you just say, it itches right here. I'm going to go see the nurse, and that's what I did. And she didn't need to see the nurse, but she didn't overutilize the nurse. So, and I told the nurse what was going on, and she checked it. And Megan came back in, and she said, it's all fine. And that was the end of the interaction around her scratching problem, her itching problem, I should say. So if you look at inappropriate social behaviors, please keep it in the context of what a child meant to do, rather than, maybe something that's really embarrassing to us. Because when you have, and this has happened to me several times, so I'm not, again, trying to be provocative in my own right, but I've had many examples of where adolescent boys, we've been out on outings or whatever, and it's not like I lost track of them, but you would say, like, you guys sit here on this bench and I'm going to go in here do this, and I could see them, and then I would walk out, and one of the guys, had pulled their penis out, and were playing with it. And again, by the way, I want to say that there's a difference between masturbation and sensory input. I know a lot of guys who it really seems to be sensory input, because it's obviously a highly sensitive place. So it's embarrassing. You come out and you've got some grown guy with his penis out and kids and mothers, and you're like, what do I do? When you crank up like that, you tend to not be able to see that inappropriate social behavior is not connected to an understanding of social behavior. Okay? I know when I go to a party not to pick my nose. Okay, I know when I go to a party, don't fart. Okay, I just know those things. But if you don't know them and you do them, and then people look at you like, oh, he's so crass, or who invited him, or that kind of thing, we find ourselves being viewed as our behavior and not as what we mean to be or what we want people to see us as. So I really recommend that you use the positive behavior supports in all of these areas, and that is talked about in the text. I tried to think about how to talk about sensory systems, and I may just want to do a separate video about that. I'm not sure, frankly, because there's a lot been said about it, but I just want to say a couple of things, and that is, you need to learn from observation what a student needs in terms of sensory feed or the reduction of sensory feed. If a student needs a high amount of sensory speed or intervention, and let me say that again. If a student needs a high level of sensory input, you want to look at the kinds of things that you can do to accommodate that within the things that you're teaching and doing in terms of interaction. I mentioned earlier about this with the hand. I have a lot of students who I work with, I'll just go up and down their arms like this, because it's something that tends to organize them and bring them together, and it helps them contain a sensory system that can't get organized. So looking at what their needs are, or the way you see them seeking input, you want to scaffold what you see that's inappropriate, and by that I mean within the environment, within the social environment, the culture, and see if you can find the same kind of feed in something that looks more socially acceptable, so that out in public, if they are seeking sensory input, they're not doing it in a way that would be inappropriate for people who might see it. The other thing I think is important, is that we need to understand or get the idea that many of our misunderstandings increase by these atypical responses. To the environment. Many kids that I've worked with who have sensory problems thrash about. You make it in your head that they don't like that toy. You've given them 5 toys, and so you're like, well, forget it. She must have just had a bad day. I don't know what's going wrong. Often that's sensory problems. And because they aren't understandable to us, because someone's not saying to us, I just can't, this is hurting, or I can't get out of this. How many times have you worn a dress or pair of pants or something that all day long you're like, I'll never wear these things again, that tag I got to cut out or whatever. We are constantly, you've seen me move around a lot, that's for sensory input. We constantly are seeking our own sensory input. But because the reactions to poor sensory organization oftentimes are very atypical, we tend to respond to it as an isolated behavior that's focused towards something that we see. Don't go there. It won't help you at all. And that's why there's so much out there now about sensory integration. I will go back to my idea, though, of embedded instruction. One of the things I don't like is that some people look at sensory integrations as a service. So, for example, the OT comes in and does sensory integration. Well, to me, what the OT is doing is they're doing sensory exercises that promote integration, and then the only way they're really integrated is that they are used within the natural environment, so the student learns to feel comfort in their body that's more organized while they can engage with others and the learning tasks that are placed in front of them. So anyway, if there are more questions about that, I'll ask you in class and I can talk more about that. Okay, and last is the motor systems. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because the text is really excellent, and this is definitely one of those areas that I wish I could just have somebody in front of me in class to show you positioning and things like that. Okay, but let's talk about muscle tone. If you're looking at the margins, you will see on one end low muscle tone or floppy. At the other end, you will see rigid muscle tone, or like, this. You see a lot of this in CP where the body is very rigid. And you need to look how to either increase, right, muscle tone for a kid who has more of a floppy tone, or decrease muscle tone for someone who's more rigid by doing it with pleasure and comfort. When I've worked with kids who I really am doing like some stretches and that's all I'm doing and that kind of thing, I always start with things like this, okay? And I don't mean to look too babyish, but I'm going to try to make your arm come down. You think I can do it? You see how my face looks? Because I want them to understand my intervention with them, or what I'm doing to their body is really about something that I want to be fun and pleasant. You always, 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 always want to remember that you are invading someone's body, okay? That you are. I don't mean that it's inappropriate or it's aggressive on your part or something like that. That's not what I mean. I mean that you're in someone's space, and because we have students who can't talk a lot of times, you're invading their space, you're invading their bodies. It would be like if I came up to one of you in class and suddenly I just started holding you and hugging you really tight, and then walked away and said, oh, I think hugging is nice. And you're like, what was that, right? I would need your permission. There need to be a reason that I was doing it. Certainly as a professor, I wouldn't do that unless, I don't know, maybe if you suddenly lost a loved one or something, I may hug a little bit or offer a hug, but I wouldn't really invade your space in a way that I didn't have permission to do. And that's what we want to think about when we're working with people's bodies. And I have found that especially around muscle tone and primitive reflexes, and there's a description of primitive reflexes on page 341, I have found that when I do in both of those areas, I found that when I look at muscle tone and try to intervene around it, I'm best served when I really try to understand how to make the experience of being with someone, quote, on their body as nurturing, pleasant, comfortable as it can be. And I also try to use behaviors that indicate to the student that I don't want to hurt them. So here is an example. Quickly, I realize this camera is whatever kind of high. So let's say that I'm doing something like this and I'm pulling the student's arms down and I'm doing something like this to stretch with my face. All of a sudden they do this or something and come over and instead of going, no, 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 you got to go further, I will go like this. Oh, I'm sorry. And then I might do patting and go, oh, that feels better. It's my way of indicating I won't abuse you. It's my way of indicating that I believe that we all deserve integrity over our bodies. We all deserve control over our bodies. I should say we all deserve control over our bodies, and that's about our integrity. That's about our identity. When we get on somebody literally and start manipulating them, it's very easy for us to become engaged in sort of a non-connected activity. So, as the text states, in terms of motor systems, it's very much like looking at the early stages of infancy, when really movement is movement against gravity. I think that's how the text refers to it. Movement against gravity is what we're teaching kids. Pull to stand, fall over, helping them understand, wobble, wobble, fall over. The ball, it drops. When we're working on those skills, what we're trying to do is help the child, organize themselves and be able to more effectively move through time and space by making their bodies work in a smoother fashion that meets their needs and promotes the most effective outcomes, particularly as they get older. Think of it the same way here. A lot of times what we're doing is we're helping children, young adults, our students work against gravity, but with very complicated issues like muscle tone and the primitive reflexes. And if that's what we're working on, we want to think about taking the care that we would take with an infant or a young toddler to teach those skills. We don't just yank them off the coffee table. We kind of go, oh, you had a boo-boo, let's go. We do something differently because we want to promote their exploration, and it's the same idea here. I mentioned something about earlier about our interaction styles and some, who we are, how we come across is so important. And that also really has a lot to do with the touch that the teacher uses when handling a student. And you always want to remember that depends on three things: muscle tone, reaction to tactile stimulation, and the nature of motor movement. And if you can think of that triad as governing the way you touch a student, your body automatically changes, and particularly as you get to know the student, your body automatically changes with my hand needs to be here. Where am I on the screen? My hand needs to be here to support this. My arm needs to be here to support this. And when you get comfortable, you don't even think about it anymore. You sort of know the points where the student feels best that you handle them. And it's so great if you can get any kind of interaction around that handling, because that's probably in many ways more intrusive than even changing diapers and things like that, even though the quote sexual nature of diapering somebody who is sexually mature sounds a little more, I don't know, to me invasive or something. It really, one of the most invasive things we do is handle people and help them become a part of the movement process, whether it's because they can tell us something or show us something, or it's because we feel their body move into us in a way that demonstrates comfort. The last thing, again, I'm back to I wish I could show you, is positioning. On pages 347 and 348, there are some really wonderful illustrations. I can never find good illustrations for positioning. What I want you to think about in positioning is in all the things I've just spoken about with muscle tone, sensory integration, behaviors, stereotypic behaviors, all of these things combined. We know that when a student is comfortable and positioned in a way that they can get better use of their body. So it might be using something like a side lier, for example, where the student lays on their side and their arms come out like this. I'm going to get it yet. There we go. This way, and the student can work better this way. We can look at that as being a way to optimize their organization. It could be trunk control, it could be a sensory thing, because we might even have something over the top so that the sensory piece comes out and we're just looking, or sensory stimuli comes out and we're looking straight ahead at something. There are all kinds of ways that we position kids so that they have the best trunk control, neck control, ability to gaze, manipulate things. Like, for example, you'll see the stander where a lot of kids spend time, because it helps them have their body in an upright position as if they were standing unsupported. And for many kids, it gives them the ability to do two things. It gives a better range of motion here, okay? And also, this is where we really want to think about, the dignity piece, is they are looking down at an activity that they sort of control. Because a lot of kids spend a lot of their lives looking this way at us. This is more of a controlling stance, or a sense of control stance. So the positioning is just absolutely critical to kids who have any kind of motor challenges. What I'm thinking I'll do is maybe look on YouTube or someplace like that and see if I would be able to find like a good video on positioning. I'll see if I can do that. But let me summarize with this, okay? What we do with people with severe, profound disabilities is like 99.9% trial and error. And you need to feel comfortable with that. If you're a kind of person who needs to have a successful outcome every 5 minutes to feel good about your work, well, don't go into teaching anyway, but you don't want to work with this population of students because everything is trial and error. Like for 3 days, every time you present the pudding or whatever to this kid, you know, the kid lights up, and then all of a sudden one day their preference changes and they knock the pudding off, and you're like, what? We worked for like how long to get that? Well, start over. Not working now. You might introduce it again the next day and see if this is now a changed preference. Could be they just had a stomachache that day. Who knows? It's sort of like, again, with infancy, we're always wondering, you know, why is the baby crying? What can I do? I rocked him. I fed him. I handed him to his dad. I let the dog kind of, you know, wiggle around him. He's still crying. We're always trying to make sense out of what's got that baby upset. Same thing here. What's got this guy upset? The last thing I want to say about this experience of working with kids is that getting them over midline like this is one of the best ways for sensory organization. It's how infants, you know, a lot of times will sleep, sort of that mode. This will really, really help. So if you're looking at how you position kids in order to get optimal environments, right? It's trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. Like everything else I've talked about, it's trial and error. That, to me, means one of two things. It means it will drive you crazy and you need to go work with children with other kinds of challenges. Or, like me, I just think it's like a good detective novel. And I really do. I'm always like, hey, where does this path going to lead? If you get into it like you're going to discover things and it becomes sort of a mission to discover, it's really fun. It really is. And that's why I loved working with those kids I worked with. In fact, I don't know, I kind of thought lately I should go back into direct practice because I really miss engaging with students who really have pretty low functional skills. And I like it because I feel like I can kind of figure out what it is and bring the best to them through those abilities. So I'll look for a video that might go over that. But again, I also want to say that so much of what we're doing will be your experience in the field, and your trial and error, and your hypothesizing and assessing, and then changing the plan again. I just hope the foundation that you're getting from this course, including what I'm talking about today, gives you those starting points as to where you can move to the next place, okay? So that I can say, I remember we had this conversation about peers and how they should work. I need to investigate this more. One thing that Mark said was, if kids are going to be a part of this, you got to talk to them. What's the literature say about that, about disclosing diagnoses or talking about kids' skill levels? What does it say about family comfort with that? So this population, this category or labeled group within IDEA, et cetera, is so complex, and the needs of each student are so unique and idiosyncratic, and you can find 1,000 words for it, that I leave you with, you know, we try our best. And we just have to keep working. And many of the things in this text, I mean, I'm hoping if you choose to stay in this area, you'll keep the text, because it provides a very rich overview of the things that we can do that enhance our teaching practices. And certainly we know kids who are as involved and have such comprehensive needs as the students in this population are so deserving of that chance, because their limitations are extremely limited at this point. So providing ways that they can find success, feelings of mastery, and ultimately comfort in themselves is really our goal. All right, thanks. I'll see you in our next class. Take care.